How many different booty exercises should you do to get a great butt? Let's chat about it.
Don't you want to look good naked?
So when it comes to the amount of exercises that you're doing specifically to build your booty, you have to think about smart training over looking at Instagram, social media, TikTok, whatever. The first thing to think about if you're trying to get a great butt is following a smart training program, a program that incorporates progressive overload, that has you doing movements where you're working the full range of motion of your glutes and working the different fibers of your glutes. One mistake that a lot of people make is going on TikTok or Instagram and just seeing someone post a random booty exercise and going in the gym and performing that. And then they do that again the next day and the next day and the next day. So the issue with that is that we know that in order to build muscle, hypertrophy means building muscle, you need to make sure that you are incorporating progressive overload over time and you're progressing over time. So in order to progress over time, you actually have to know what you're doing over time. Just because you feel the burn or you're sweating a little bit doesn't mean that you're building your butt. So you gotta be smart about it. You gotta pay attention to the things that actually matter, and that's gonna come from joining the Flex Plan. You wanna make sure that you're incorporating exercises where you can work your glutes through its full range of motion. So you have 3 main glute muscles, and then there's also some other butt muscles underneath those muscles as well. And so we wanna make sure that we're doing exercises that can work that full butt muscle really. So doing exercises that mainly target your glute max, because that's your biggest butt muscle, that's gonna be kind of the meat and potatoes, or paying attention to the exercises that you're doing most often and being able to load those and grow with those versus the ones that are maybe more of the accessory exercises like the kickbacks and maybe band exercises, things like that. So those are important and definitely want to incorporate those, but making sure that you're, focusing on what matters most, which is prioritizing those hip extension movements, which are gonna work that glute max and also the glute med and glute min, and then also incorporating kickbacks where that can work your glute med. Also incorporating other exercises that are going to isolate those smaller muscles a little bit more. So to isolate your glute medius, for example, doing a 30-degree angled kickback, or to isolate your glute minimus, maybe doing a kick out to the side. Those are different accessory movements that you can incorporate for sure, but you don't want to make those the main movements. Another thing to think about is working your glutes in a variety of planes of motion. So all that means is, for example, hip extension when you're doing hip thrusts or RDLs, that's gonna be working mostly the front and back motion, right? So hip extension. Versus if you want to work your glute medius muscle a little bit more, it's going to be working more so in that 30-degree angle back and forward. So doing 30-degree angle kickbacks with a cable or a band, for example, or straight out to the side. So we call that abduction. So that's gonna work more of your glute minimus and some of the other smaller muscles within there. And that's gonna be things like abduction with a band or a cable machine. But the biggest thing to realize too is that it's not just because you're isolating one of your glute muscles, it's not that the other muscles aren't working. So all of those muscles are working at the same time, but some are gonna be biased a little bit more or isolated a little bit more than others. Another thing to think about is instead of how many more booty exercises can I add to my workout or add during the week, is really just focusing on picking movements that work for your structure, that you can load up so that you can create that, stimulus that you need in order to build your glutes, and focusing on proper setup, technique, execution. Those are really, really important versus thinking about just adding more and more and more. That's something that a lot of people make mistakes on, is just, okay, how can I add more versus how can I get better? When I started to think about that specifically with my training, I started to see the most progression. It's like, instead of focusing on doing more or adding more or doing the most popular Instagram workout, it's like, how can I start to get better at the movements that I'm doing and the movements that I know fit my structure and kind of check the boxes for what I mentioned before? Can I load them up efficiently to make sure that I'm creating that stimulus that I can progress with? Are they movements that work that full range of motion? Stretchers and squeezers, I talk about this a lot, but if you're doing all of the squeezer movements, if you're doing all of the booty band, sensation, I feel the burn, I feel the squeeze there, versus doing movements that are more of the stretchers like the squats and the RDLs, where you might not necessarily feel a huge stimulus in your glutes with those movements. You're doing yourself a huge disservice. And the reason for that is because we know from research that the most muscle growth actually occurs from those movements that are more the stretchers. So the lengthened position movements versus the squeezers or the shortened position movements. So if you're doing a bunch of squeezers and no stretchers, then you're gonna be not growing as much as you could in terms of your glute growth, in terms of your adaptations and things like that. Another thing to think about is just making sure that instead of prioritizing, doing more and picking more movements and doing as much as possible, think about how you can get better at the actual movements you're doing and adding enough load and resistance to progress with those movements. Movements that work for your structure, making sure that you're incorporating both of those stretchers and the squeezers. So the stretchers are like the RDLs and leg press and things like that, where it's hardest in the stretch position. And then the squeezers are gonna be those hip thrusts or those glute bridges or those kickbacks, where it's hardest in what we call the contracted or the shortened position. You wanna make sure that you're incorporating both of those. And so that's gonna come from just making sure that you're following a structured, smart program and focusing on that. So instead of, looking for the best new booty exercise that you see on TikTok, or adding more and more booty exercises into your regimen, don't focus on that. Focus on following a smart, structured, progressive program. Don't prioritize adding tons of different exercises. Focus on what you're doing now. Focus on getting better, not doing more, and focus on those main movements that you know are gonna be able to progress over time. Women, we believe